I wanted to give you kind of a lecture for you to listen to on your own time or at home. You're going to be doing part of this work yourself in class, looking at the textbook to figure out the causes of the Spanish-American War and how it changed U.S. international relations. I'm going to give you my context for it. You can listen to this on your own, or you can simply read the PowerPoint yourself. It's up to you. So to start with, we're going to be looking at the Spanish-American War. This is a map of Cuba right there. You can see that that Cuba was a colony of Spain. Spain had a few colonies left. They weren't much of an empire anymore. They still have the Philippines over in the Pacific. They have Cuba. They have, I think, a couple of small areas in like South America. Nothing, maybe in Africa too. So nothing really significant. And what will happen is that Cuba's demanding independence, and Cuba has this sugar economy, and it has, because of its proximity to the United States, there was a great deal of trade going on there. And this is what's going to make the U.S. interested. That, and the U.S. is just starting to kind of, out of that closing of the frontier mindset, right? They're starting to pay attention to global affairs and that sort of thing. So we're going to see that the main battleship will blow up under mysterious circumstances. It's really not so mysterious. It's actually they store the ammunition too close to the boiler, and that's what causes it to explode. But we don't figure that out until like the 1970s. And so what will happen is these circumstances will kind of work together, and you'll get this momentum for war that will happen very quickly in 1898. It's a very short war, though, only lasts 6 months, and this will result in the U.S. being a world power. This picture right here shows you Uncle Sam getting ready for war. This kind of describes it all. Uncle Sam pulling up his sleeves with a knife in his teeth. Cuban butcheries, De La May letter, Maine outrage, insults, Spanish insolence. All these things are kind of in those bubbles around Uncle Sam, depicting that we're ready to go to war. So this conflict is really about American pride in a lot of ways, as well as about territory. So you had a revolution in Cuba that really begins early in the 1890s. Spain reacts by sending a general and a bunch of troops, and they start rounding up Cuban citizens and start putting them into what we now call concentration camps, meant to kind of control the population. This is a precursor to the concentration camps of the Holocaust. But I want to point out that this was a very common practice among European countries. If you're talking about Africa or Asia or anything like that. In fact, the United States will use these in the Philippines later on when we get to talking about the outcome of the Spanish-American War. So you want to be sure that you understand kind of how the U.S. begins to get involved. That the U.S. is very, very concerned with imperialism, and these things that are happening in Cuba with these reconcentration camps look really bad, and Americans don't like that it's happening so close to them. Now, a lot of this is being encouraged by, first and foremost, yellow journalism, newspapers by Pulitzer and Hearst that are saying, you know, hey, look at what the Spanish are doing. They're doing these horrible things. They're raping women, and they're starving people, and there's all this disease and stuff. Now, these newspapers are not providing the context that lots of other European powers are doing the same thing. The other issue, too, is you have Cuban exiles that are living in the United States that are encouraging this kind of yellow journalism and are continuing to encourage revolution in Cuba itself. This is kind of an example of a depiction of this yellow journalism and how they kind of depict that that Cuba is really being, you know, tortured. It's in the frying pan, that kind of thing. So as we have this increasing demand by Cubans, and encouraged in part by the yellow journalism and American support, by the support coming from Cuban exiles, you're going to see that that you have even more tension building. And so McKinley's going to try to insist that Spain gives Cuba its independence. Spain actually offers Cuba self-government, but not full independence. Cuba rejects that. And what will happen is that you'll have you'll have these Spanish loyalists that don't appreciate American interventions and that kind of thing, and they start having a riot. Well, McKinley will respond by sending the USS Maine. He's very concerned about American businesses and Americans that live in Cuba or have interests in Cuba. So the USS Maine is there to kind of keep an eye on things, keep an eye on the Spanish. And of course, all of this is the result of yellow journalism. In the meantime, the De Lomé letter gets published. This is a letter from a guy by the name of De Lomé, who is a diplomat. He basically writes this letter back to the Spanish government saying, oh, McKinley's, a dummy. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't really want war. Kind of insults McKinley. And this gets printed, so that makes Americans very insulted. And then the USS Maine explodes, right? And everybody says, oh, it's all the Spanish's fault. And in fact, Teddy Roosevelt was one of the most vocal people. Remember, he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at this time. And he says, oh, I know it was the Spanish. The Spanish absolutely blew up the USS Maine. And so you have this process by which the American public, fueled by yellow journalism, Teddy Roosevelt's proclamations, you're going to have Congress demanding that we go to war, until finally McKinley says, okay, fine, and he asks for a declaration. And so essentially what's going to happen is that the U.S. recognizes Cuban independence before Spain even lets Cuba go, and declares war. And so then the war begins, right? You can see these headlines here from these newspapers. This is kind of a depiction of what we call the big type war. That's Pulitzer and Hearst, kind of messing with the typeface, if you will. You're going to see very quickly the U.S. is going to dominate in the Spanish-American War. The naval battle goes a lot better than the Army battle, and the Navy is going to be most powerful in the Pacific, which we'll get to in a second. When you're talking about Cuba specifically, you're talking about you'll have some naval ships show up there. They chase the Spanish ships away. We'll get our Army offloaded. In the meantime, Teddy Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, has resigned his post, created the Rough Riders, which is like an auxiliary military group that travels with the Army to go fight in Cuba. So he has this group of volunteers that basically are funding themselves. And so they travel with the Army to Cuba. And the Army will eventually successfully take the capital of Santiago. But it takes a little while, and conditions are pretty bad, and there's disease, and it's hot, and they're not well equipped. And so, it's not a perfect story. Now, unfortunately, that's pretty much the only story we hear is, oh, the Rough Riders were there and they charged up the hill and, they defeated the Spanish. It wasn't quite as nice and neat as all that, but that's the main idea that you need to know. So the U.S. will occupy Puerto Rico as well as basically having control of Cuba. And very quickly, we're going to see the end of the war. Treaty of Paris is signed in 1898 that grants Cuba its independence like the U.S. had requested. The U.S. will pay for Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So Spain will then give up its territory in these areas. And the U.S. will pay for them, and Cuba will have its independence. So the United States is able to kind of pat itself on the back and say, see, we didn't take territory, we bought territory. Except, of course, they bought the territory under force. So you're going to see that the U.S. now becomes a world power because of this, because of the Treaty of Paris, because of the Spanish-American War. And that's kind of one of your big concepts that you need to take with you, that this is how it affects international relations. This is Teddy Roosevelt with his Rough Riders. So let's move to the Philippines and the Pacific conflict. So while this is happening with Cuba, with the Rough Riders and the Army and the ships being chased away from Cuba, you're going to see that Commodore Dewey is going to send the Pacific Fleet to the Philippines, very quickly going to dominate the Spanish there. They were not prepared. He blockades or basically attacks the Spanish colonies. He'll take the island of Guam. And so we very quickly get control of that area. What will happen is that we reject the government, self-government by the Philippines. The Philippines had had their own revolution, had been a little less noticed than the Cuban Revolution, but very similar in kind of them trying to demand independence. And the U.S. shows up, and at first the Philippine revolutionaries are really excited. They're like, yes, Americans, they're going to do for us what they're doing for Cuba. Except the United States has zero interest in that. Remember, they're interested in the Pacific. They're concerned about Japan. They want to keep trade with China. They now have Hawaii. So they have a lot of reasons to want to be in the Pacific. With Cuba, you're talking about an independent country. One that's very close to the United States, one that the U.S. kind of sees itself as taking on a big brother role, if you will. So the U.S. will reject Philippine self-government. This will eventually anger the revolutionaries, so there'll be some conflict between Americans and the Philippines and the Filipinos, and that's going to be pretty nasty. Lots of people getting killed, lots of Filipinos getting killed, some Americans. You're going to have Americans using the concentration camps, all that kind of stuff. And so it's pretty bad until about 1902 when William Howard Taft goes there. This is where he kind of comes in. And he kind of reforms the Philippines and eases those tensions. And the Philippines will be controlled by the United States until after World War II. So this is how the whole issue with the Philippines plays out. Commodore Dewey. So the pressing question now is what to do with the new territories, particularly the Philippines. Do we give them independence? Do we keep them as a territory? And this is some of the questions that we're stressing about, right? And of course, if we argued that the Spanish-American War was about freeing oppressed peoples, it's kind of hypocritical to be then holding on to the Philippines the way we were. And so you've got a lot of anti-imperialists, and you can see their names right here, that argue that first off, it's expensive to have colonies and have territories. It's going to require a big navy. It's going to require lots of investment. We're going to have too much cheap labor. We already have enough cheap labor. We already have enough poor people. And fundamentally, it violates American principles. And so there's lots of questions about these ideas of annexation, whether you're talking about the Philippines or Hawaii or anything else like that. This cartoon right here kind of depicts this whole scenario that you have these 4 surprise babies, right? And if you can look more closely, you can see they're very clearly the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And what are we going to do with them? Now, of course, keep in mind, Cuba's technically independent. So this cartoon kind of says it all right there. Puerto Rico will continue to be a territory. In fact, we still have Puerto Rico as a commonwealth. In 1900, there's a 4-Acre Act that makes Puerto Rico an unincorporated territory, basically gives Congress complete control over Puerto Rico. It will take probably another 30 years, 40 years before we start to kind of undo that. So kind of keep in mind the 4-Acre Act. Then you're going to see that in Cuba, we initially had this idea of Cuban independence. And before we went to war, one of the factors for the anti-imperialists to be okay with the Spanish-American War was that there had to be this amendment that Cuba would be independent. So that's what we call the Teller Amendment, okay? So they passed this along with the act of war, okay? So Cuba's going to be independent, except after the war's over, the United States isn't so sure they're comfortable with that. So basically, they then go back and redo this, and they call this the Platt Amendment. So the Platt Amendment will essentially give the U.S. control over Cuba. It will establish a military governor, that we get to oversee the creation of the Cuban Constitution. Cuba is not allowed to treaty with other nations. We control Cuba through its debt. We can intervene with Cuba at any point. And we essentially treat Cuba like a protectorate, where they technically have self-government, but we call the shots. We tell them what to do. And so that's a very important distinction, because remember, we were supposed to be about Cuban independence. But here we see that we go to territories with Puerto Rico, we go to a territory with the Philippines, we go to Cuba, and we treat them as a protectorate. So very clearly, we aren't really supporting this idea of independence. What we want is the idea of imperialism. And Cuba will be under the control of the United States really until 1934. And then it won't be until, and then in the 1950s, Cuba has its own revolution, kicks the Americans out, and that's how Castro comes into power. And we'll be talking about that a little bit in the spring. This cartoon right here kind of shows kind of this idea of school begins, the United States instructing these four countries, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Hawaii, and the Philippines, on independence, on democracy, and all that kind of stuff. So this idea of Uncle Sam as being kind of this this teacher. And this cartoon really has a lot of interesting little details to it. If you look over here, here's the Native Americans way far off. We technically have them in school, but not really. You know, they're very far removed. Over here's a Chinese person kind of not really being allowed in, because remember, we've got the Chinese Exclusion Act. We even have an African American over here that's not being educated but is forced to do work. And then here's Uncle Sam kind of waving his wand at these unruly students right here. So just kind of keep that in mind. This picture kind of says a lot. It's kind of an interesting cartoon. So factors contributing to the Spanish-American War: the sinking of the USS Maine, sympathy for Cuba that's enabled by the yellow journalism, and a desire to protect American investments. How do U.S. international relations change? Strong naval power, the war with Spain, and then we're going to ultimately gain territory because of this. So we have control over Cuba. It's a protectorate, it's independent, but we tell it what to do. The Philippines are annexed. Puerto Rico is made a territory, Guam is made a territory, and Hawaii is annexed as well during this process. So this is really kind of the big factor in how we become an imperial power. We talked about the basic ideas of imperialism earlier this week. This idea is really solidified under the Spanish-American War. So this is why this kind of overlaps with American imperialism. And the U.S. is really kind of joining the other European countries in this process of having